I must warn you before we begin. This is not the history lesson you grew up with. Forget the polished portraits, the clean marble statues, and the schoolbook stories of noble kings and wise emperors. Behind the crowns, behind the royals and glittering palaces, lay a reality far darker than most dared to imagine. These rulers were not simply leaders of nations, they were men who bent morality until it broke, who turned their deepest desires into law, and who believed that their thrones gave them the right to claim anything or anyone they wanted. Their secrets were whispered in candlelit halls, hidden in dusty chronicles, and passed down as rumors too disturbing to be told in classrooms. Yet history remembers them not for wisdom or justice, but for obsessions that scarred entire empires. Stay with me, because once you see the truth behind these thrones, you will never look at royalty the same way again. Throughout history, kings were never just rulers sitting on thrones. They were men believed to be chosen by God Himself, walking on earth as if they were untouchable, existing above the laws that bound ordinary mortals. Their crowns were more than ornaments of gold, they were shields of divine authority. And with that sense of divinity came temptation. Temptation to bend rules, to take what was forbidden, and to indulge desires without consequence. For some, it began subtly small luxuries, private indulgences. But for others, that temptation grew into dangerous obsession, the kind that could twist morality into something unrecognizable. Behind the towering walls of palaces and castles, in rooms veiled by velvet curtains, away from the eyes of common people, many monarchs cultivated secret lives. There their hunger was not only for power, but for pleasures so unsettling that even their closest allies feared to speak of them. These were not harmless distractions or fleeting affairs. They were performances of dominance. Acts designed to remind nobles, courtiers, and even foreign envoys that the king's will was absolute law. To defy him was not simply rebellion against a man, but against the very order of heaven itself. And so throughout centuries, whispers of their darkest indulgences survived, passed in secret, recorded in scandalous chronicles, and preserved as warnings of how unchecked power corrupts even the mightiest thrones. No list of history's most depraved rulers can ever begin without mentioning Caligula, the infamous emperor of Rome. To the public, he was a spectacle of divinity, a living god draped in purple robes, parading through the streets as if Olympus itself had crowned him. Statues were raised in his honor, prayers offered in his name, and senators bowed so low that their foreheads nearly touched the marble floors. But behind the gleaming columns of his palace, the truth was far darker. Caligula transformed Rome's court into a theater of humiliation. What should have been the seat of empire became a stage for excess. He weaponized intimacy, turning it into a tool of dominance. Senators who feared him found their wives summoned to his chambers, forced into situations they dared not refuse. The sacred temples of Rome, once places where citizens prayed for divine guidance, were desecrated, their altars overshadowed by his obsessions. Even the most honored traditions of Rome were mocked. Banquets that should have been celebrations of empire turned into twisted performances where power, pleasure, and cruelty fused into one, and yet no one could speak against him. To question Caligula was to question a man who demanded worship as a god. Foreign envoys returned to their homelands horrified, carrying tales of a ruler who seemed less like a man and more like a monster. Whispers spread across Europe and beyond. Rome, the eternal city, was in the hands of madness itself. Centuries later, across the English Channel, another monarch would leave a legacy of power, scandal, and obsession, King Henry VIII of England. Most remember him for his 6 wives and the break with the Catholic Church. But what often gets lost beneath the polished portraits is how deeply his personal lust and paranoia reshaped an entire kingdom. For Henry, marriage was not a covenant before God, it was a contract of power. Wives were celebrated at coronations and praised in poetry, yet the moment they failed to deliver what Henry demanded, loyalty, beauty, or a male heir, they were cast aside like pawns in a game of survival. Some were banished, others imprisoned, and 2 lost their heads under the swing of the executioner's axe. Inside the royal court, the atmosphere was suffocating. Every glance, every whisper could be twisted into suspicion. Ladies-in-waiting feared being chosen as the king's next obsession, knowing that favor could turn to ruin overnight. Queens lived in palaces of glittering jewels, yet beneath the gold and silk, terror followed their every step. Beyond the palace walls, Henry's private desires had devastating public consequences. In pursuit of freedom from one marriage, he split England from Rome, tore down monasteries, seized church lands, and forced his people to choose between loyalty to their faith or loyalty to their king. The echoes of that decision would shape England for centuries. For Henry VIII, lust was never separate from politics. His passions were written into the laws of his country, his jealousies carved into the fates of queens, and his obsessions etched into the very soul of a nation. Now we travel from England to France, into the glittering halls of Versailles. Here ruled King Louis XV, the monarch once hailed as Louis the Well-Beloved. By day, he embodied the polished image of French absolutism, robes of gold, ceremonies of grandeur, the court bowing at his every word. But when night fell, Versailles revealed a different story. Hidden behind the palace's elegant walls was the Parc aux Oeufs, a discreet residence where the king kept a rotating circle of young mistresses. They were carefully selected, brought to him in secrecy, and dismissed just as quickly once his attention waned. To the world, Louis was the refined monarch of Europe's most dazzling court. Behind closed doors, he turned intimacy into an institution, a hidden empire fueled by desire. These secret indulgences came at a cost. Maintaining his chambers of pleasure drained the royal treasury, already weakened by endless wars and lavish spending. While aristocrats dined under golden chandeliers, the people of France starved in the streets, their voices growing restless. Each whispered rumor of the king's secret rooms carried beyond Versailles like sparks in dry, grass sparks that would soon ignite revolution. Historians often debate whether Louis XV himself understood the consequences of his private life. Perhaps he thought the grandeur of Versailles could forever shield him from scandal. But the truth was unavoidable. The more he indulged in hidden excess, the more he eroded the sacred image of kingship. By the end of his reign, the love of his people had withered into contempt, and Versailles itself had become the symbol of corruption. Spain, too, had its cursed monarch. Ferdinand VII began his story wrapped in hope. When he first returned to the throne, the Spanish people called him El Decido, the Desired. To them, he was the savior of a broken nation, the king who would heal the wounds left by war and foreign occupation. The streets of Madrid rang with cheers, church bells tolled in celebration, and prayers rose skyward for the young monarch who seemed to embody renewal. But power has a way of revealing truth. It did not take long for Ferdinand's promise to sour. What began as the rule of a savior soon twisted into the reign of a tyrant. Suspicion clouded his mind. Rivals were crushed not with honor, but with cruelty. Ministers were dismissed at a whim, friends betrayed, and critics silenced with iron chains. His court, once imagined as a beacon of recovery, became infamous as a place of grotesque indulgence. Loyalty was no longer built on trust or love of country. It was purchase-bought with submission, demanded through fear. Those who dared question him vanished into dungeons, and even family members became pawns in his paranoid games. The Spanish people who once cried out his name with joy came to despise it. For them, Ferdinand VII was not a savior but a curse. Today his legacy is not one of glory, but of betrayal, remembered as one of the most corrupt and reviled rulers in the long history of Spain. The truth is, Caligula and Ferdinand were far from alone. Europe's history is haunted by kings who turned thrones into cages for their people. In Sweden, there was Eric XIV, at first celebrated as a brilliant mind, a scholar king who promised prosperity. But brilliance soon slipped into madness. His paranoia grew so strong that courtiers feared to speak in his presence. Those who whispered against him, or those he imagined whispered, were dragged into dungeons. His court became not a place of order, but a playground of cruelty, where suspicion was enough to seal one's fate. In Russia, Tsar Peter the Great carved his name into history with reforms and expansion, but whispers tell another side. Behind the glory of empire lay darker indulgences, private humiliations. Desires carried out in secret chambers, acts so shocking that they were spoken of only in hushed voices, passed from one foreign diplomat to another, never written, but always remembered. And beyond the great powers, across Europe's patchwork of smaller kingdoms and duchies, the same pattern repeated. Princes, dukes, and lesser monarchs believed their crowns gave them not just authority, but the right to gratification without consequence. Servants, nobles, even their own kin were treated as possessions, not people. The deeper we look into these royal courts, the more disturbing the picture becomes. This was not an occasional scandal, it was the very culture of monarchy itself. Not the exception, but the rule. A reminder that power, unchecked and divine in name, was too often used to cross every imaginable boundary. But what, in the end, was the true cost of these horrifying secrets? It was not just whispered scandals, it was the fate of entire nations. Kingdoms crumbled beneath the weight of greed and lust. While rulers indulged their darkest urges, treasuries emptied, armies weakened, and enemies grew bold. Wars that might have been avoided were ignited, not for the defense of the people, but because kings followed their desires instead of their duty. Treaties collapsed, alliances shattered, and borders burned because the men in crowns placed passion above responsibility. And for ordinary people, peasants, nobles, even queen's life became a prison of fear. They were pawns in games they could never escape, sacrifices on the altar of power. History makes one thing clear: when the bedroom outweighed the throne room, empires did not simply falter, they fell. And so, the crowns of history gleam not only with jewels, but with shadows too deep to ignore. For every tale of glory sung by poets, there is a darker truth hidden in palace chambers, whispered in back corridors, and buried beneath the stone of forgotten tombs. Kings remembered as powerful rulers often carried with them horrifying secrets. Secrets that stained their reigns and tainted their legacies forever. Their portraits hang in museums, their names echo in textbooks. But rarely do we ask what truly lurked behind their eyes. And here is the question I leave you with. If these stories survived the silencing hands of history, how many others were erased completely? How many rulers, praised as heroes, carried desires so dark that their own people dared not even whisper them aloud? Stay curious, for history's most disturbing truths are never lost. They are simply waiting in the shadows,